The palace of Isfahan glowed like a mirage beneath the velvet sky, its tiled domes and golden minarets reflecting the light of 100 flickering torches that lined the marble courtyards, where music played like a whisper from a dream, low and rhythmic, seductive in its pull. The grand hall tonight was transformed into a sea of silk and shadow, where noblemen reclined against jeweled cushions, eyes half-lidded from wine and lust, waiting for the night's entertainment. And then she appeared, Mehrunisa, wrapped in crimson silk that clung to her curves like desire itself, stepped into the light as though she belonged to it, her face veiled with fine golden mesh, revealing nothing but her eyes, deep, coal-lined pools of mystery that held promises no man could resist. The air shifted when she moved, hips swaying with hypnotic grace, the bells at her ankles chiming like secrets too beautiful to be spoken aloud. She danced with the elegance of a panther and the poise of a queen, every movement a subtle message, a silent seduction, a calculated stroke of power, and as the drums deepened, she turned in a slow circle, letting her veil flutter slightly, just enough to reveal the curve of her mouth, the hollow of her throat, and the court collectively exhaled. None of them knew her name beyond what she gave. No one knew she was not just a courtesan, but a weapon wrapped in perfume. Her body trained not only in pleasure but in the art of infiltration, for she had not come to entertain, she had come to conquer. After the performance, the Grand Vizier, an aging man with sharp eyes and fingers stained with ink and cruelty, summoned her privately, leading her into his chamber heavy with sandalwood smoke and lust. He offered her pomegranate wine and thin smiles, his eyes moving over her like a butcher surveying fine meat. But she let none of it reach her. She leaned close, let her perfume rise between them like a veil, and whispered the right words at the right time, until his hand found her waist and, hers, silently, reached for the ring of keys at his side. The exchange was brief, unseen, power hidden beneath submission, and as his mouth brushed the edge of her veil, Mehrunisa allowed herself a moment of stillness, listening to the pounding of her heart, not from fear, but from purpose. Later, she walked alone to the corridors of the harem, where mosaic walls glittered in torchlight and marble floors reflected her ghost-like image, passing silent guards and whispering maids, until she reached the place only spoken of in murmurs, the mirror room, the harem's hidden sanctuary, where women plotted as much as they pleasured, where truth was reflected in 1,000 glass eyes. There, Layla waited, an older courtesan, sharp and sensual, her body draped in silver, her lips red with wine, and her gaze full of unspoken knowledge. "You dance like a queen," she said, swirling her cup. "But in this place, queens fall harder than anyone." Mehrunisa smiled beneath her veil and replied, "Then I shall make sure I rise higher first." Around them, other women stretched across pillows, some laughing softly, others watching Mehrunisa, with the narrowed eyes of competitors sensing danger. Later still, in the deep hours of night, Mehrunisa stood alone on a private balcony overlooking the dark gardens of the palace, the wind pulling gently at her veil, the sound of night birds echoing through the trees, her thoughts heavy and full, for her mission was only beginning. She had seen the Sultan only once, watching her from behind a carved golden screen during her dance, his silhouette framed in shadow, unmoving, like a lion studying his prey. She knew he would summon her soon, and when he did, everything would shift. She was not here to entertain him, not truly. She was here to find something or someone, and when the time came, she would use every inch of her body, every curve of her breath, every sigh, to get it. Her dagger lay beneath her robes, cold against her thigh, and her heart, though wrapped in silk and honey, was as sharp as the blade. This was Isfahan, where beauty was currency, pleasure was politics, and a courtesan could be queen or corpse by morning. The day after her veiled performance, the palace of Isfahan pulsed with murmurs like veins under silk. The name Mehrunisa flowed between lips with longing and fear alike, and though the courtesan kept to the shadows of the harem, her presence stirred the air like perfume too potent to ignore, even within the inner chambers of the royal women, where fountains sang and rose water misted the marble air. Her name whispered between jeweled lips and narrowed eyes. She walked to the garden courtyard draped in blue silk that trailed like fog behind her, bare feet silent on mosaic tiles, the hidden dagger still kissing her thigh, for the game she played was far from over. After last night's theft of the vizier's ring of keys, Mehrunisa had slipped into the records chamber before dawn, unrolling scrolls not meant for courtesan eyes, her fingers tracing names, secrets, and symbols, all in search of one. The lost prince, a man exiled in whispers, possibly alive, possibly dead, but connected to the people who once raised her not as a courtesan, but as a spy. Tonight, her seduction would climb higher. She was summoned again, not to the vizier, but to the royal training chamber, where the palace's sensual arts were taught not with shame, but with near-sacred discipline. The chief instructress, Lady Courtesan, was famed for shaping girls into living poems, and she wasted no time assessing Mehrunisa. "You have the eyes," Courtesan murmured, brushing a hand over her face. "But beauty without control is chaos." What followed was no mere lesson in pleasure, but a ritual, candlelit movements on velvet cushions, silken breathing, the art of touch without touch, of dancing with one's aura rather than hips. But as Courtesan watched her move, her gaze shifted from teaching to suspicion. Mehrunisa was too poised, too aware, and behind every gentle gesture there was calculation. Later that evening, as musicians filled the women's courtyard with oud and daft melodies, Mehrunisa found herself beside the baths, where a two-guard broke the rules and leaned too close, charmed by her gaze, asking if she'd sing as she did last night. She laughed softly, placing a hand to her chest, and leaned forward just enough for her eyes to drop. And then, in a blink, she pressed her dagger gently between the ribs of one, her mouth still smiling, her hand delicate. "If you ever approach me like that again," she whispered, pulling away with the blade slick, "you'll bleed before you touch." No scream, no chase, only her silk fluttering away as if she'd never been there. But the message spread like fire. That night, the Sultan finally summoned her, not to speak, not to touch, but simply to observe. Behind the golden lattice of his private balcony chamber, he sat in shadows, silent and unseen, while she danced alone in the center of the empty throne room. No audience, no music, only her breath, her body, and the distant rustle of silk. She felt his eyes on her like heat from a flame, though she never turned. Instead, she moved as if the palace itself had possessed her, slow, aching, sensual, her feet tracing forgotten symbols in the marble floor, every movement a question she didn't speak aloud. When she stopped, the silence was alive with tension. She waited. He never emerged. But on her way out, a single gift lay on the silver tray by the door, a white rose soaked in saffron, the mark of interest. Back in her chamber, she collapsed on her silken bed, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of power shifting. Outside her door, a woman's silhouette stood briefly. Courtesan, perhaps, or Layla, watching. Somewhere within the palace, the blood she spilled was being cleaned. Her name was being weighed like gold dust, and the game of silk and swords had only just begun. The walls of the palace hummed with breath and secrets, And within that endless hush of silken drapes and murmuring fountains, Mehrunisa found herself summoned to a place few had seen and fewer survived, the Sultan's private hammam, hidden beyond the gardens where jasmine hung heavy in the air and the marble path led to a door gilded in gold and silence. No servant dared enter without invitation, for this bathhouse was more than a place of cleansing. It was a sanctuary of whispers, of stolen confessions, and of sensual diplomacy. The steam struck her first, warm, perfumed, heavy, wrapping around her like the arms of a jealous lover. Inside, the architecture curved like the body of a woman, domed ceilings studded with starlight holes, water basins shaped like crescents, and a central pool that steamed with rose and saffron. She slipped into the water slowly, veils left behind, her skin gleaming in the low amber light. She was alone, or so she believed, until the water rippled behind her, and a voice as soft as a sigh broke the silence. "You're not like the others." Turning gently, her wet hair clinging to her back like ink, Mehrunisa saw the woman who spoke, tall, poised, with eyes the color of burnt honey and lips too calm be innocent. She wore a translucent shift that clung to her curves, unafraid, unashamed. "You're the favorite now," the woman said, wading closer, "but favorites fall fastest." Mehrunisa held her gaze, feeling the charge between them, not rivalry, but recognition. "And you are?" she asked softly. The woman came closer until their breaths shared the same space. The Sultan's first wife, hidden, forgotten, but not dead. Her name was Soraya, and her story unraveled between steam and silence. Once beloved, then pushed aside by politics and ambition, Soraya had faded into the palace walls, living like a rumor, watching from shadows. "He still dreams of me," she whispered, "but his eyes are elsewhere now on you." What happened next blurred the line between warning and seduction. Soraya reached forward, brushing a wet strand of hair from Mehrunisa's cheek, fingers lingering, eyes not blinking. Their lips met not with hesitation, but inevitability, a kiss forged of curiosity, hunger, perhaps defiance. In the bath's sacred quiet, their bodies pressed, skin on skin, steam rising between breaths, a union neither expected, both accepted. It was not love, it was revelation. And in the final tremble of their embrace, Soraya whispered into her ear, "You think you're playing the game, but you haven't seen the board." That night, Mehrunisa lay awake in her private chamber, her body cooled by the garden breeze, but her mind afire. Soraya's kiss still lingered on her mouth, but so did her warning. She rose and lit a small oil lamp, then pulled from beneath the floor tiles the scrolls she had stolen from the record's vault. Names, dates, connections, all pieces in a puzzle that pointed toward one truth. Someone inside the palace was not just watching her, but using her. Her eyes fell on the mark again. A falcon's claw, the sigil a lost prince thought dead, but whispered to live still in disguise. She remembered her childhood, the way a man in a green cloak had saved her from fire, given her a name, a task, a path. Could he be here? Could the Sultan know? She was tangled in every kind of desire now. The Sultan's growing obsession, Soraya's forbidden touch, her own craving for power, for answers, for revenge she hadn't fully named. Outside, the palace breathed in its sleep. Inside, Mehrunisa dressed in silence, not in silks but in servant rags. She knew her way into the servant corridors, the crawl spaces behind the walls. She followed memory and instinct, crawling through dust and dark until she reached the upper gallery, and through a tiny slit in the latticework, she saw the Sultan himself, seated in his private chamber, shirtless, back scarred not by battle, but by ritual. A woman entered, not Soraya, not a courtesan, but a healer. She rubbed oil into his skin, speaking of dreams of a prophecy of the falcon returned. Mehrunisa's heart slammed. The Sultan whispered a name, Darien, a name she had never heard, but would now never forget. She turned from the slit, chest heaving. Soraya had been right. This wasn't just seduction. This was war. She returned to her chamber just before dawn, naked beneath her robe, but covered in truth. Her eyes sharper, her body heavier with the weight of lust and knowledge. She sat before her mirror, traced her lips with crushed rose balm, and whispered, "Let him call for me. I'm ready now." The palace of Isfahan did not sleep that night. It held its breath. The air, once thick with perfume and silk, now shimmered with the weight of things unsaid and undone, of passion twisted into purpose and love bent into betrayal. In her chamber, Mehrunisa dressed not in silk, but in blood-colored velvet, not for seduction this time, but for war. The rose balm she pressed to her lips had been steeped in crushed poppy and poisoned saffron, sweet enough to seduce, lethal enough to kill. Tonight, the Sultan had summoned her again, not as a performer, not as a pupil, but as a woman he had chosen, as the one he whispered about in fevered dreams. But as she stepped out of her room, eyes burning beneath her veil, she knew this night would not end in kisses. It would end in crowns. She walked slowly through the gold-lit halls, each footstep echoing like fate, past courtesans who had once envied her, past servants who lowered their eyes, past Layla, who now bowed not as a rival, but as an ally. For Layla had seen the truth days ago, had watched Mehrunisa read old scrolls by moonlight, had seen the symbol of the falcon appear again and again, on robes, on rings, and the Sultan's own seal, and knew the girl from the south was no mere courtesan. She was a child of rebels, raised by ghosts, sent to reclaim forgotten legacy by seducing an empire from within. In the Sultan's private hall, candles danced like spirits. He sat waiting, shirt open, chest rising with anticipation, crown placed loosely beside him, as if love and power were one and the same. He beckoned her forward with one hand, his voice low. "You've haunted me since the first night. Even the stars have your shape." She smiled, slow and soft, and stepped into his arms. Their bodies met like thunder wrapped in silk, lips tasting of spice and shadows, hands wandering familiar terrain, her breath warm on his throat as she kissed him again and again. But beneath that passion lay precision. She offered him wine laced with honey and poison, placed on the edge of the bed like temptation incarnate. He drank, unaware. When he leaned back, she straddled him, her fingers on his jaw, and whispered not a moan, but a name, Darien. His eyes opened wide. Confusion. Then fear, then fury. "Who told you that name?" he growled, pushing her off, but it was too late. The poison began its bloom. He staggered to stand. She watched him like a queen watches a fallen king, no longer seducing, but judging. "Your dream ends tonight," she said, removing her veil, "and the real heir returns." And then behind her, the doors opened, and from the dark stepped a man cloaked in green, the very ghost the Sultan had tried to erase. Darin, the rightful son, the Falcon reborn. He had survived exile, survived silence, and now stood with eyes like fire beside the woman who had made his return possible. The Sultan tried to speak, but blood bloomed from his lips like roses. He fell forward, collapsing not in battle, but in a bed of velvet and betrayal. Outside, the first call to prayer echoed across Isfahan. A new dawn was rising. By morning, the guards had sworn allegiance to Darien. Layla became mistress of the harem. Soraya, the Sultan's forgotten wife, emerged from the shadows and was given her rightful place. And Mehrunisa, she stood on the balcony where once she had gazed alone, now beside the man who wore the crown she had helped her claim. Her hands were stained with secrets. Her lips had ended an empire, but her eyes still danced like candlelight behind a golden veil. She had entered as a courtesan. She left as a queen. The palace of Isfahan did not sleep that night. It held its breath. The air, once thick with perfume and silk, now shimmered with the weight of things unsaid and undone, of passion twisted into purpose and love bent into betrayal. In her chamber, Mehrunisa dressed not in silk, but in blood-colored velvet, not for seduction this time, but for war. The rose balm she pressed to her lips had been steeped in crushed poppy and poisoned saffron, sweet enough to seduce, lethal enough to kill. Tonight, the Sultan had summoned her again, not as a performer, not as a pupil, but as a woman he had chosen, as the one he whispered about in fevered dreams. But as she stepped out of her room, eyes burning beneath her veil, she knew this night would not end in kisses. It would end in crowns. She walked slowly through the gold-lit halls, each footstep echoing like fate, past courtesans who had once envied her, past servants who lowered their eyes, past Layla, who now bowed not as a rival, but as an ally. For Layla had seen the truth days ago, had watched Mehrunisa read old scrolls by moonlight, had seen the symbol of the falcon appear again and again on robes, on rings, and the Sultan's own seal, and knew the girl from the south was no mere courtesan. She was a child of rebels, raised by ghosts, sent to reclaim a forgotten legacy by seducing an empire from within. In the Sultan's private hall, candles danced like spirits. He sat waiting, shirt open, chest rise with anticipation, crown placed loosely beside him, as if love and power were one and same. He beckoned her forward with one hand, his voice low. "You've haunted me since the first night. Even the stars have your shape." She smiled, slow and soft, and stepped into his arms. Their bodies met like thunder wrapped in silk, lips tasting of spice and shadows, hands wandering familiar terrain. Her breath warm on his throat as she kissed him again and again. But beneath that passion lay precision. She offered him wine laced with honey and poison, placed on the edge of the bed like temptation incarnate. He drank unaware. When he leaned back, she straddled him, her fingers on his jaw, and whispered not a moan, but a name, Darien. His eyes opened wide. Confusion, then fear, then fury. "Who told you that name?" he growled, pushing her off, but it was too late. The poison began its bloom. He staggered to stand. She watched him like a queen watches a fallen king, no longer seducing, but judging. "Your dream ends tonight," she said, removing her veil, "and the real heir returns." And then, behind her, the doors opened, and from the dark stepped a man cloaked in green, the very ghost the Sultan had tried to erase. Daring, the rightful son, the Falcon reborn. He had survived exile, survived silence, and now stood with eyes like fire beside the woman who had made his return possible. The Sultan tried to speak, but blood bloomed from his lips like roses. He fell forward, collapsing not in battle, but in a bed of velvet and betrayal. Outside, the first call to prayer echoed across Isfahan. A new dawn was rising. By morning, the guards had sworn allegiance to Darien. Layla became mistress of the harem. Soraya, the Sultan's forgotten wife, emerged from the shadows and was given her rightful place. And Mehrunisa, she stood on the balcony where once she had gazed alone, now beside the man who wore the crown she had helped her claim. Her hands were stained with secrets. Her lips had ended an empire, but her eyes still danced like candlelight behind a golden veil. She had entered as a courtesan. She left as a queen. Mehrunisa had tasted power, and found it sweeter than any lover's mouth, heavier than any crown. Yet as she stood beside Darien in the sunlit court of Isfahan, wearing a robe stitched with gold falcons and blood in calligraphy, she knew that ruling was not the end of the game. It was only the next level. The court now bowed before her with silk-tongued praises and lowered eyes, but behind every flattery was a flick of a knife. Darien was king in name, returned prince in legend, but everyone knew it was she who held the true power, not with armies, but with eyes, with lips, with the memory of how she killed a sultan between kisses. Still, something gnawed beneath the silk of her new life. Not guilt, no. She had never been naive, but unrest. Soraya had vanished after the coronation, leaving only a scented note that read, "Queens must never grow roots." Layla had become high consort of the harem, her loyalty a velvet rope. But even ropes fray. It was in the garden, days later, that the first true threat revealed itself. Not with sword or poison, but with poetry. A hooded poet was granted audience, offering a gift, a single scroll wrapped in green silk. The verses written were beautiful, achingly so, but hidden within the metaphors was a message only trained spies could decipher. The serpent sleeps not in the jungle, but in the rose. Her blood ran cold. Someone inside the palace had turned. That night, Mehrunisa returned to her private bath chamber, the one the Sultan had once built for his lovers, and lit a dozen candles, each flame reflecting in the polished tile like twin eyes watching her from beyond. As she sank into the scented water, she traced her own scars beneath the surface, the places no man had ever seen, the memories that no crown could erase. She was not safe, not now, not ever, and she was no longer interested in safety. That same night, she called for one of her oldest allies, not Darien, not Layla, but a servant girl named Shiren, once mute, now trained in the art of silence and steel. Together, they went into the oldest archives of the palace, deep beneath the foundations, past the burial chambers of forgotten kings, and uncovered a record sealed with black wax, a map of the hidden harem, an ancient sisterhood of women trained not to pleasure, but to control. Queens behind queens, lovers who ruled through skin and shadow. And at the heart of that network, a woman named Zara, called the Serpent of Silk, the only one who had ever dethroned a king without touching a blade. And she was alive, somewhere in Isfahan. The next morning, a letter arrived at Mehrunisa's door with no seal, no signature, just 4 words, written in crimson ink. You stole my throne. She pressed it to her lips, then burned it without blinking. The garden outside her window swayed in the wind, the roses blooming wider than they should, petals soft as lies. Mehrunisa dressed not in red this time, but in black, embroidered with golden thorns, and beneath her robes she strapped a dagger once more. Let them come. Let the serpents rise. She had not risen this far to kneel again. She had not kissed death to be frightened by perfume. She was not a queen made to be tamed. She was fire in velvet, and in the garden of serpents, only the dead stayed still. It began with a scent, not rose or saffron, but jasmine and ash, drifting into Mehrunisa's private chamber just past midnight, carried on the same wind that once brought her to the palace as a veiled weapon. Now, as queen in all but name, she had everything she once dreamed of: power, fear, longing. And yet, what crept into her lungs was not perfume, but a warning. She rose from her divan silently, robe flowing like spilled ink, and moved toward the open balcony, where on the edge of the stone railing, placed deliberately, sat a single black silk ribbon, folded into the shape of a serpent. Her heartbeat didn't quicken. It slowed. The name Zara, the serpent of silk, had returned from myth into breath, and now, into her city. The scroll she and Shiren had found in the palace crypt spoke of Zara not as a woman, but a doctrine. She had once ruled the entire Eastern Empire through seduction and blood, creating an underground harem of loyal courtesans who answered to no king, no god, no man. It was said she could stop a war with a whisper, poison a vizier through a kiss, and vanish into a shadow after turning a prince against his father. If she had returned now, it was not for peace. Mehrunisa summoned no guards. Instead, she called for Layla, who arrived in silence, eyes heavy with night but sharper than steel. She's in the city, Mehrunisa said. Layla didn't ask who. She simply poured wine and replied, "Then she'll want something taken from you." But that was the trouble. Nothing had been stolen. No attack. No dead maid. No stolen scroll. Nothing. Except perhaps Darian's mind. He had grown strange in recent days, distant, paranoid, touching her with a hunger that felt more like suspicion than love. He would stare at her in the mirror and ask, "What were you before me?" She would answer softly, "Everything you feared." But inside her, doubt stirred. Could Zara be whispering in his ear already? That night, as she walked through the shadowed palace corridors, she heard music, but not from the court. A single flute, low and ancient, played a melody she had only ever heard once before, as a child, when her mother had been executed in secret, and the same tune was played to drown out her screams. She followed it now through the halls like a scent, barefoot, breath caught in the throat, until she reached the old bathhouse, long closed, its doors sealed with wax and memory. Inside, candlelight flickered, and seated atop the marble fountain, barefoot and ageless, sat a woman draped in layers of translucent black, her face covered in a silver veil, her hands adorned with rings that bore ancient seals of cities that no longer existed. Zara, the serpent of silk. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not seductive. It was terrifying in its calm. "You remind me of myself before I burned." Mehrunisa said nothing. She stepped forward, and the air between them changed, not attraction, not fear, but recognition. A mirror of power, past and future. Zara continued, I made the mistake of loving a king, and you made the mistake of replacing one. She tossed something at Mehrunisa's feet, a lock of Soraya's hair, tied with a crimson thread. Mehrunisa bent, picked it up, and whispered, Where is she? Zara smiled beneath her veil. Where all women go when they get in the way, behind the throne or beneath it. Then she vanished. No footsteps, no breath, just a trail of perfume and silence. That night, Mehrunisa returned not to her chamber, but to the royal armory, and for the first time since arriving in the palace, she armed herself fully, not with seduction, not with scent, but with cold steel, a jeweled dagger at her hip, a chain of obsidian beads around her neck, a vial of fast-acting poison stitched into her sleeve. She wasn't playing the game anymore. She was rewriting it, and if Zara wanted her crown, she would have to bleed for it. At dawn, Darien called for her, eyes hollow, lips dry, whispering her name like a curse and a prayer. And behind his throne stood a shadow, tall and veiled, watching, smiling. The serpent had entered the garden, and the queen was sharpening her fangs. The palace of Isfahan stood still beneath the crescent moon, its marble halls filled not with music or laughter, but with tension so sharp it could slit the silk of silence. For tonight was a reckoning, and the game of eyes, veils, and venom had come to its last move. Mehrunisa walked barefoot across the marble, dressed in black threaded with gold, her hair unbound for the first time since she had entered the palace, flowing like ink behind her, no longer hiding, no longer seducing, a queen no longer pretending to be anything else. The courtiers whispered behind lattice screens. Some prayed, some plotted. She passed Darien's chamber, but did not enter, for the man who once held her heart had long since been hollowed out, filled with Zara's poison not in his veins but in his mind, turned from lover to puppet by a serpent older than vengeance. Tonight, they would all gather in the mirror hall, once built for moonlit dances and forbidden kisses, now to become the stage for truth. She entered first, followed by Layla, her loyal shadow, and Shiren, silent and steel-eyed. On the floor, a circular mosaic of twin falcons glowed under the lamplight, a symbol of dual thrones, of rulers and rivals. Then Zara arrived, veiled, ageless, and smiling with lips painted the color of crushed plum, her movements like smoke, her eyes calm and endless. Darien followed, his crown askew, his hand trembling. Mehrunisa met Zara in the center of the circle, their shadows merging, reflections multiplying the mirror walls around them like illusions of fate. You stole what I built, Zara said softly. Mehrunisa smiled. I perfected what you abandoned. Zara reached beneath her cloak, not for a dagger, but for a perfumed vial, amber-colored, ancient. Then let us finish this in the old way. Mehrunisa took the second vial from Layla. Both women drank, one sip each. The trial of silk, a ritual older than empire. One vial held nothing. One held death. If both lived, fate had chosen peace. If one fell, so be it. They drank, eyes locked. Time froze. Breath stalled. And then nothing. No collapse. No cries. Two women still standing. But it was a trick. Zara smiled again, lips twitching. Her eyes flickered. And then she fell, not with violence, but with grace, as if sinking into the floor she once ruled. The serpent had been outplayed, not with poison, but with preparation. The true vial had been swapped hours ago by Shiran. Mehrunisa never drank. She never needed to. Darien rushed to Zara's body, crying out her name, not from love, but from madness. The spell had broken. He saw Mehrunisa now with terror, not desire. He fled. The court watched from behind curtains as Mehrunisa rose alone, unshaken, and spoke one sentence that sealed her legacy. From this night forward, no queen will kneel. And so, Zara was buried beneath the mirror hall, in a tomb of her own design. Darien vanished into exile. Layla ruled the harem, and Mehrunisa reigned not from the throne but above it, draped in black and gold, a crownless queen, her name whispered across empires, her legend carved not in stone but in skin, silk, and blood. They say she was seen once more years later, walking alone beneath the moon, barefoot again, smiling at the stars, her eyes softer than history allowed. But that was the end, not of her story, but of all stories that dare imagine